Last October was when Sidewalk Toronto as a project was announced. And I'm just going to give you a tiny bit of backstory on that. It is a $50 million investment commitment made by a company called Sidewalk Labs. And in this deal that has been struck, no land is changing hands. It is being really misreported that somehow Google now owns a 12-acre plot of land in Toronto. That is not the case. So Sidewalk Labs, which is a sister company to Google, subsidiary both of Alphabet, is partnered with Waterfront Toronto, which is a tripartite government agency that's in Toronto. So that is its own interesting governance structure because there is one elected representative on that entire agency. That's one person from the city council. So it's an otherwise appointed sort of agency that's responsible for developing just over 800 acres on Toronto's waterfront. This discussion we're having about Sidewalk Toronto is 12 acres of land that is owned by Waterfront Toronto. The bulk of that real estate is called the Portlands. The most of it is owned by the City of Toronto, which is important to understand those things, and a little bit of private ownership there. So that's kind of like setting the table. And so this $50 million deal was done to say that these two would come together, Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto, to build a master innovation and development plan. So over the course of the year, Sidewalk Labs would invest up to $50 million US to come up with a plan that would then need all levels of political approval to then develop a 12-acre plot of land. Okay, it is not for the entire Portlands. There's a whole other thing. That 800 acres in Toronto, real estate developers have been looking at that space for a long time. It is one of the largest undeveloped parcels of land in North America. It is both in a flood, like it required over $1 billion of flood protection, which was just committed, and it's also polluted. So it's one of these areas where everybody's kind of trying to figure out how to make it work. And so that's the context. Is that all clear? Yeah, any questions about that? Because that's important. And as you can tell, there's some governance and other issues at play. And I think what is interesting here, is this role that Sidewalk Labs may be looking to become a or master developer of a piece of land and also be doing things with smart city technology. Does anybody else have any experience coming from a place where there was actual land development connected with technology? Anybody have any of that? Okay, so because this feels like an important difference in someone who's just selling technology to a city. This is actually sort of making a move into a section of space and how that entire parcel will be developed. Okay, so now I'm just going to tell you a little more, and then I want to open it up.
12 of the 800 acres.
Yeah, 12 acres.
Okay.
Yeah, and yes, and so one of the things that really came clear in the Sidewalk Labs created a 200-page response for this opportunity, and a lot of the language in it was saying, we may want to scale to the rest of the Portlands. We may want to scale to the rest, technology companies like to think about scaling. And the City of Toronto very quickly said, that's nice, that's not land that is in the purview of this deal. But just as another thought around, what can you do on 12 acres versus what can you do on 800 versus what can you do with the City of Toronto proper, Sidewalk Labs has no contract with the City of Toronto. So that's also important, right? Because you got a whole bunch of people at the city being like, oh, what's going on over there? but are not actually a party to a contract. So that's really the sort of backstory I think that's relevant. The only other piece I'll add to this is my personal response when this deal was announced was a concern that we didn't have the laws and policies in place to manage that sort of a thing. So I feel like what I've heard at this conference so much is like everybody's kind of knowing, oh, there's something is like we got a lot of problems. So I don't think it's to say that in a lot of other cities everybody has their policies and laws lined up at all. But it did sort of set this trigger of like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And I think the last piece before we talk about advice on what to do with things like this is I can tell you that although this 200-page proposal had things like autonomous shuttles, car-free zones, sidewalks where the snow would melt for bikes so you could ride your bike, garbage robots that were underground, green energy is referenced a lot, affordable housing, like it's like an entire 200 pages. the question that is being asked persistently is, what is your business model? What are the products and services that you want to do here? And the answer has been real estate, infrastructure, technology, and venture capital. And when I do that, I'm like, what's not there? So this is very much a challenge to get hands on what the plan is, because we've had all this enthusiasm around innovation and making an innovation hub and opportunities, but without a real clear definition of what the products and services might look like. So I share that with you because I find that particularly confounding when you're trying to be helpful, is to not have the thing that is happening available to you. So there has been a year of consultation. We are halfway through, and so far nothing has been given as details of a plan. In terms of like the long history of Waterfront Toronto, the idea was that there would need to be cooperation among 3 levels of government to pull this off. So to do it intentionally, to say there's 3 people from each level of government sitting on this, sitting on board of this agency, with the mandate to develop that land and to work together through issues that will be shared, across the 3 jurisdictions. So it was intended to help with the knowledge that doing that kind of real estate development may require that collaboration. So that's,
Exclude others.
Doesn't exclude others, and there are wonderful books written about this. Melissa knows one of them, sort of like on the history of Waterfront Toronto, that we can share as resources as well. To date, they have a pretty good reputation in terms of what the work that has been done on the land that they have developed. So that's also important to know, that they identify as the public steward, the stewards of these public lands. That's their language. So, having said that, I would start with one of my colleagues here, just in terms of beginning a discussion around when technology, Internet of Things, sensors, surveillance are all sort of being brought to bear as things that we should be really excited about. And as we try to work on these things from a community capacity development response, maybe some of your initial thoughts, I'll just leave you with my last one, which is I don't understand where the urban planners are. Like, I'm just sort of waiting for them to roll up and be like, we don't need all this data. We've been talking about affordable housing for a long time. We've been talking about sustainability for a long time. So I could put you on the spot for that in terms of the urban planning community. But do you want to start? Maybe
Sure.
Some thoughts on that?
I'll just say something brief about that point. There's an interesting stat that a nonprofit in the UK just posted recently, that in, I think it's like 1970, I think it's something like maybe 49% of the architects in the UK were publicly employed architects. And today it's 0.7%, okay? So the reason why a lot of urban planners are MIA on this issue is because they're all mostly in for-profit organizations. And so you can't be too critical of the clients that may be hiring you, whether they be cities or other architecture firms, as part of a multi-bid deal. So there's that sort of political economic dimension of what's going on. And then there's a community of practice or cultural critique, which is that a lot of traditional urban planning is coming from a very top-down model of planning. So very technocratic, very expert-driven, not participatory, not co-creative, not peer-to-peer, which are things that I think a lot of us that are coming from the more sort of digital consciousness are wondering about or are seeking. So there are alternative progressive modes, and so I come from that tradition within a nonprofit called Project for Public Spaces that has led the creation of placemaking. And I've been trying to innovate that to adapt to 21st century issues, and that's what we call digital placemaking, which is about co-creation, participation. How do we live together, and how can we have this in a much more inclusive and equitable manner? But that's just a fringe sort of, or a small percentage of the planning community. And those of us in the placemaking side of things have been critical about the whole question of technology in cities for a lot of these reasons, because basically it's giving sort of like acceleration and amplification to that Robert Moses technocratic Corbusier God view of like, and now we have more power to pull the strings and control everything. And you can trust us because now we have AI and machine learning and bigger data and blah, blah, blah. So we can almost do away with participation because artificial intelligence will somehow be better than everything else. There are literally planners out there, urban scientists, which I think is kind of a euphemism really, that believe that we will algorithmically be able to determine the best sort of urban governance and spatial planning, and that will be able to take over a certain percentage of how the future cities are made, which could be a whole, I mean, I don't know where to start sometimes when I hear things like this. So.
Work at the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and we look at how Canada's national security laws affect civil liberties and human rights in the country, and try to push back against the impacts of those laws. And so we haven't dealt a lot with smart cities, but what we have been dealing with a lot is how Canada's national security agencies, like CSIS, Canada's Domestic Spy Agency, and the RCMP, the National Police Force, and you know, in conjunction with that, how they work with local police, are increasing their tools for surveillance and data collection. So when we're looking at something like a smart city, and there's discussion about how we'll be collecting more and more information and more details about people in their neighborhoods and in their communities, it raises serious concerns to us both about how those companies will be holding on to that information, whether or not they will be sharing it with law enforcement and in what ways, both consciously or actively, and so entering into agreements, possibly selling the information to law enforcement, and I'll get into that in a second. But also, if they start collecting this information, even if they say they're going to hold on to it and that they will not, you know, proactively share it with law enforcement or national security intelligence, that new laws coming in Canada may mean that they won't really have a choice in whether or not they can share it because of different ways that they can be compelled essentially to share that information. So whether that's through warrants, through eventual laws that, you know, the debate that comes back regularly and isn't on the table right now, but around what they call a lawful access of what information police and security agencies can access without warrants and just with basic orders, production orders, which don't have the same standard of, don't have to meet the same kind of standard and rigor as a regular warrant. And so there's a lot of concerns about just the storage of that information, having that on hand, what it can mean in terms of what could eventually be compelled and shared with national security, and what could be shared proactively. And I mentioned the selling of the information. So right now there's a bill on the table in Canada called Bill C-59. It's a national security bill. And one of the things that it does, it would allow Canada's Domestic Spy Agency, CSIS, to collect what's called publicly available information. And they define that as any information that essentially is in the public realm, either just publicly, and you can look it up, or that can be bought. And so when we're talking about the streams of revenue and funding for these companies and the directions that they go in, that, you know, would law enforcement and intelligence agencies be able to simply just buy this information and then input it into the work that they're doing? And the big concern there, and you mentioned algorithms, and algorithms I think is something that's come up a lot this week, and is something that we're trying to wrap our heads around because both municipal and national policing and law and intelligence agencies are talking about going into algorithmic, and have already started using algorithmic predictive policing. They don't like that term, but essentially it's what it is. And so what does that mean on a national level when we're talking about security agencies? And what does it mean on the municipal level when we know that the Toronto Police Department, the Ottawa Police Department, Vancouver Police Department are already talking about and experimenting with algorithms for how they police neighborhoods. And then there's all kinds of questions about how those algorithms come about. And then the last thing I want to touch on is just what kind of rights that implicates, because I think often we think just about privacy rights, which I think is really important. And we need to, it's important that we push back on this idea that we don't have a right to the privacy of that information, that the only reason we want privacy is because we have something to hide and otherwise you should be fine with it. And that's a big problem. But it also raises serious questions about what kind of profiling goes into policing and how this information will be used to legitimize profiling depending on how algorithms are applied and who's making those decisions. So the further targeting of, for us in the when we look at national security, especially of Muslim and Arab communities or people who are, identified and labeled as Muslim or Arab or as threats to national security. We're seeing it more and more with indigenous populations and land defenders. And so there's a big question about how, if we start this at the municipal level, how it kind of trickles up, but also how the technology and the rules that the national security agencies, which often don't get as much scrutiny as local police agencies, what powers they're getting and how that kind of trickles down and can affect that, what local police are doing.
Okay, so coming from the perspective of communities that can be targeted through this type of the use of this data, I think that there's several really critical questions that need to be asked and explored. So number one discussion that we've been having throughout this conference is about who actually will own this kind of data. And so when we're talking about the ownership of data, when it comes to, for instance, even talking about disaggregated data, where we're talking about an entire community, for instance, that is data creator owned data trust, and we do not want the state to have access to that data because of the historical trauma that we have gone through in terms of cultural genocide and how data information has been used against us. So the question of ownership is one that is just not coming up in many of the discussions that I've heard so far, and even with yesterday, and we were saying, who's asking that question? And so the Toronto Declaration that came out 2 days ago, if you've had a chance to read it, about sort of human rights and machine learning, if you actually go through it, again, there is no question being answered or even raised about that data ownership. And that's very serious because, again, some communities, so I've given examples where we've used data to advocate against systemic racism, because we can use that data, to prove that there are issues of human rights violations and issues that we need to address. Because often it'll be asked of us, well, you say anecdotally that there is a problem, you're going to have to show the data to demonstrate that. Whereas if I do that, then that same data can later be used against me. So it is a very critical issue. And then the Canadian government, so they have representatives here, and they had a panel this morning where they were introducing their new draft of a policy around AI and human rights. And again, there is nothing addressing the ownership of data. So then when you take it to the context of Sidewalk Labs and how they are going to be collecting who knows what data about which communities, and where it may be disaggregated. So they say where there's often this idea that, well, when we're talking about privacy, it's about individual privacy. So don't worry, Amira, we won't know anything about you. Okay, that's one thing. But if you start gathering, data about me as a woman, as a Muslim, all the other identifiers potentially as a community, there's no discussion about community or collective privacy and the right of communities to say, we don't want disaggregated data, used by who knows who. And then, of course, when Tim talks, I am just, shaking in my boots because we know that no matter what type of promises and assurances that we may get, that these data points are not going to be used for nefarious reasons. You just have to ask Meher Arar or the 4 other men who were, secretly renditioned to other countries before big data even really crossed any of our minds. And we know that the reality is far, far different and far, far more worrisome. And again, these conversations don't seem to be happening in these quiet meetings that are going on.
Why do we want smart cities? How do we want ownership to work? What, I think that's a lot of what you guys are thinking about in terms of digital public space. What do we want? And I would say, sort of trying to wade in locally to the, I work at Mozilla, mostly work globally, but live here, trying to wade into the sidewalk conversation. I don't know what I want, or in this conversation really don't hear us collectively coming forward with what we want. And I think that's the question to kind of step back and start asking about smart cities. And I would say working full-time in digital rights type stuff, smart cities is very absent in the agenda. There isn't a what do we want. In the smart cities kind of have gotten off scot-free as this sort of antiseptic, nice, shiny thing where there hasn't really been a critical debate or a visioning of what we want. So I think now is a really good moment for us to be thinking about that. And so maybe as a little bit of a narrative hook to kind of get us thinking, just jump back in history. When Daniel mentioned Robert Moses, how many people knew who Robert Moses was? Because I thought you might not. That's a pretty big number, actually. Yeah. And let's see if there's a bigger number. How many people know who Jane Jacobs was? So a bigger number. And so Robert Moses, for those of you who don't know, was the New York urban planner, kind of corrupt dude, to say the least, who did many, many things, including trying to bulldoze Soho that Jane Jacobs stopped him from doing, thank God, because I like New York. But more importantly, just was symbolically a part of a period of urban planning that just assumed that we want the automobile without saying, how do we want our cities and our neighborhoods to work? And I bring that up because it feels like that is the moment that we're in right now with smart cities, is just assuming we're going to collect that data, not even getting to the ownership thing, but how many sensors, what kind of sensors, for what purpose, what kind of data do we want to collect? We're assuming we want the automobile. And the places where we did that and didn't think about what cities we wanted went very badly, whether that is suburbanization in North America, whether that is ruining of historic neighborhoods and redlining in North America. So I don't have the answer, but I think we collectively, as Google collectively shows up as this alphabet entity, we don't have the Robert Moses villain to point to. We have a collective villain. I would say we all need to collectively be Jane Jacobs and think about what is the kind of city that we want here on those 12 acres, in the rest of waterfront Toronto, globally as we start to imagine smart cities. So that to me seems like a really great moment we're in. And these are some of the good questions that I would start with. Ownership is really a key one. So if we assume that we're going to be in a world where we embed technology into our cities, a lot of sensors, a lot of things that move garbage under the ground or whatever they do, if that's what we want, starting with the question of informed consent, but not at the level of me clicking yes on an app, but actually as a principle in planning processes. So before I design what data I'm going to collect into the city in a way that I can't opt out of, what's the way we actually choose what things we want to collect data for, and actually have informed consent be an upfront planning principle and not something that is on me as the user in an incredibly uninformed way to opt in or opt out of. I mean, in the case of a smart city, all I can do is not go to that neighborhood. And so there is a thing, we just don't have planning frameworks around this kind of design. So that's one thing that, as Jane Jacobs, we might think about, right? How do we design informed consent into the front end of the process? And then a piece that Mozilla, we have a thing called the lean data practices. And what we try to do is have a principle that you collect the minimum possible data for any function where data is valuable, that you keep it as briefly as possible. So maybe you need that data, but you don't need to keep it. And they have a lot of stewardship around data that is valuable to keep. And obviously, consent is at the front end before you do any of that data collection. So that's another thing, is to look at things like a lean data principle that you would apply in that planning framework, or in what we would hold ourselves to. Only collect the minimum data, don't keep it, and so on. And then I think ownership, and then another kind of concept in ownership that really cities, I think, are uniquely positioned to have a debate around is, questions of ownership and questions of shared value creation. So as we license Uber to drive around the city, who owns that data? Does the city own it? Do we collectively have access to it? Can we control how they use it? Because there is data being created all the time, which, Uber is a money-losing non-transportation company. It is actually a three-dimensional global mapping platform, which is, plans to monetize on the data that it's collecting. But that data is actually kind of built off of our backs and our pocketbooks and through city licensing. So same thing goes for Sidewalk. Not only who owns it, is it collectively owned, but who can use it. So you could use it actually to come back and prove systemic racism, under certain conditions. So I think, to me, that's the kind of questions. Those are just little hints, and I don't have the answers. Or maybe collectively, as the collective Jane Jacobs of this moment, what do we imagine we want smart cities to be? What could be some principles? And the last thing I'll say to everybody, but especially to the Torontonians in here, we had a session earlier where Barcelona and New York and by remote PowerPoint, Amsterdam, presented some digital rights principles that they're adopting as cities. They're not digital rights bills, they're not in laws at this point, but they are, backed by the mayors of those cities. And I really think for Toronto, we need to move quickly to develop some principles like that. And there's a woman who's Nazma Ahmed, who's not here, who works with Bianca and I, who's going to lead a public consultation process around that kind of thing. And the reason is we're not we are going to get so pretzeled up in that waterfront Toronto structure and the divide between the city and waterfront Toronto and not being able to act that having any principles is just going to get down into the weeds. It's already down in the weeds so fast. But if we can adopt at City Council a set of principles on things like this and we have a framework to point to, it's better to have something that isn't binding, that represents our values, that's in place now, so that as this, Google and waterfront Toronto pretzel around, we can keep pointing and say, less data, our data. So that's what I want to encourage us as the Torontonians in the room to try to do.